Pack your things before the guests arrive. My son didn't shout it. That's the part people never understand about the way a family breaks. They imagine slammed doors and thrown plates. But the cruelest things get said quietly, in a voice low enough that the neighbors won't hear, and gentle enough that later he can pretend he never said them at all. Bradley leaned into the doorway of my workshop with one hand on the frame, the way a landlord leans when he's come to inspect a unit. He didn't step inside. He never stepped inside anymore. Sawdust bothered his suit. "The Ashfords will be here at 7, he said. "Sloane's put a lot into tonight. I need the place looking a certain way, Dad. I need it looking like ours." He glanced at my hands, at the plane I was holding, at the curl of oak shaving still hanging off the blade. "Just take the truck. Go stay at the lake cabin for a couple nights. Please, please." He always added the please. It cost him nothing, and it bought him everything. I set the plane down on the bench. I looked at my son standing in the door of the shop I'd built 40 years earlier, in the house I'd raised him in, and I felt the tear come to the corner of my eye before I could stop it. He saw it, and he looked away, embarrassed, the way you look away from a stranger crying on a bus. Then he left. His footsteps went back up the stone path I'd laid myself, past the maple his mother planted, and into the house. And I stood there in the smell of cut wood and thought about the one thing my son had forgotten. He'd forgotten whose name was on the deed. My name is Raymond Bishop. Most people call me Ray. I'm 71 years old, and until the day my son told me to pack my things, I believed the two of us had made peace with who we each were. I built houses for a living. Not the kind you see in magazines with the infinity pools and the imported marble. I built the kind of houses where a schoolteacher and a mechanic could raise 3 kids, where the stairs didn't creak in year 2, with a roof held through 40 winters because the man who framed it gave a damn. I started with a single collapsing farmhouse outside Traverse City, Michigan, that I bought for almost nothing when I was 26 because it was all I could afford and I was too stubborn to rent. I gutted it down to the bones. I taught myself what I didn't already know, and I learned the rest from an old Polish carpenter named Stanislaw who paid me in knowledge because he couldn't pay me in money. I sold that farmhouse for 4 times what I put into it. Then I bought 2 more. Then a piece of land nobody wanted on a ridge above a lake, because I could see what it would be even when everyone else saw scrub and swamp. For 45 years I got up before the sun. I came home after dark with my knuckles split and my back aching, and I built. Not skyscrapers. Not anything a city would put my name on. Just good houses for good people, and quietly, 1 parcel at a time, I bought the land under half of them. I wasn't born to any of it. My father repaired refrigerators. My mother took in laundry. Everything I owned because I'd earned it with these 2 hands, including the 3-story timber and stone house on the ridge that my son now wanted me to disappear from for the evening. People assumed I loved that house because it was worth money. The truth is simpler, and it's the reason all of this happened the way it did. I loved it because I built it. Every beam in that house I raised. Every joint I cut. And in the cornerstone of the fireplace, down where nobody would ever think to look, I'd carved 2 sets of initials and a date. RB and MB. And the year we finished it. MB Margaret Bishop. My Maggie. She died 3 years ago. Her heart simply stopped one Tuesday morning while she was standing at the kitchen window watching the fog come off the lake. The doctors used a lot of words. All I heard was that I'd walked into a room and my life was over and hers had already ended without me. She was the warm one. I was the quiet one. She was the reason our son had ever laughed as a boy, and I've come to believe she was the last thing holding him to the ground. Because within a year of burying her, my son Bradley began the slow work of pretending he'd never come from a man like me at all. Let me tell you about my son, because you have to understand him for any of the rest to make sense. Bradley was a good boy once. I mean that. He wasn't born cruel. He was born wanting more, wanting up, wanting to matter in rooms where the Bishop name meant nothing. And somewhere in his 30s, that wanting curdled into shame. Shame of the sawdust. Shame of the pickup truck. Shame of a father who ate his lunch out of a metal box and had dirt permanently worked into the creases of his knuckles. He'd started going by Bradley instead of Brad around the time he met Sloane. Sloane Ashford. Her family had money, the kind of money that comes with 3 generations of it, the kind that doesn't smell like a job. Her father, Gerald Ashford, ran Ashford Development, the biggest commercial builder in the northern half of the state. Shopping centers, office parks, the sort of glass and steel work that gets your name on a plaque and your photo in the business pages. I'll say this plainly. From the first dinner I ever had with the Ashfords, Gerald looked at me like I was the help who'd wandered in from the yard. And my son watched him do it and said nothing. That was the night I understood what my boy had decided to become. After the wedding, Bradley and Sloane moved back into the Ridge house. It made sense at the time. It was too big for one grieving old man. There were more rooms than I could fill with memory. And I told myself I was glad for the company, glad to have my granddaughter under the same roof. But slowly, a thing happened that I didn't have a name for until it was almost done. The house stopped being mine. Not on paper, never on paper. In the air. In the way conversations stopped when I came into a room. In the way Sloane redecorated Maggie's kitchen and threw out the hand-thrown pottery my wife had loved without asking me a single question. In the way Bradley started saying our house and the property, and once in front of a real estate agent I wasn't supposed to overhear, my father's staying with us for now. Staying with them. In the house I built. On the land I bought before my son could walk. I let it go. Every time I let it go. Because I'd learned something raising him and burying her, that a man can absorb almost any insult if he tells himself it comes from grief or ambition or a hard childhood he half remembers. I made excuses for my son the way you keep patching a roof you know in your bones needs replacing. You tell yourself it'll hold one more season. It held right up until the whisper in the workshop. Here is the thing about being underestimated when you're old. Young men think that fading means disappearing. They see the gray hair and the slower walk, and they assume the mind behind it has gone soft too. My son looked at me and saw a man who puttered in a shop, who couldn't work a smartphone, who'd built some houses once in a life that no longer counted for much. He thought the house was as good as his. He thought I was furniture that happened to breathe. He never once asked to see the deed, because if he'd sat down some evening and actually looked, he'd have learned what took me most of my life to build. The Ridge house, the cabin at the lake, 22 rental homes across 3 counties, the 4 commercial lots on the highway that Gerald Ashford himself had been trying to buy for 11 years and could not, for the life of him, get his hands on. None of it was in my name. It was all in the Bishop family trust. I set that trust up 30 years ago, back when Bradley was in grade school, on the advice of a young attorney named Diane Kessler, who's now 64 and still the only person outside my family I trust completely. She told me once, "Ray, you build things to outlast weather. Build your estate to outlast people." I didn't fully understand her then. I understand her now. Everything I owned sat inside that trust. And I was the trustee, which meant that not one board foot of that house, not 1 acre of that ridge, moved anywhere without my signature. Not to Bradley, not to Sloane, not to anyone. My son was planning a dinner to impress his father-in-law inside a house he did not own, sitting on land he did not control, to celebrate a future built on a fortune that was never going to be as the way he thought it would. He just didn't know it yet. And I want to be honest with you, because I've had a lot of time since to think about the man I am. In that moment, standing in my workshop with a tear drying on my face, I did not feel powerful. I felt heartbroken, because the deed wasn't the thing I'd lost. The deed was still mine. What I'd lost was the boy who used to hand me nails one at a time and ask if he could hammer just one. The morning after the whisper, I didn't take the truck to the lake cabin. I drove into town to see Diane. Her office is above a hardware store, which has always struck me as exactly right. She keeps the same coffee maker she's had since the Clinton administration and a philodendron so old it's practically structural. When I walked in without an appointment, she took one look at my face and told her assistant to hold everything. Somebody died, she said. No, I told her. Somebody's planning to. I told her about the whisper, about make it look like ours, about the Ashfords coming to dinner. And I watch her go very still in the way she gets when the lawyer in her wakes all the way up. Ray, she said carefully, how much has Bradley told the Ashfords about what he owns? I hadn't thought about it in those words. But once she said it, a cold understanding moved through me. I don't know, I admitted, but he keeps calling it the property. The Ashfords have been to the house twice. Gerald walked the ridge line last spring like he was measuring it. Diane pulled a folder from a drawer without even having to look for it. Everything about my affairs she keeps within arm's reach. I need to tell you something, and I need you to sit down for it. Set. 3 weeks ago, she said, I got a call from a lawyer at a firm downtown. Ashford's firm. They were doing what they called preliminary due diligence on a joint venture, a development partnership. And they wanted to confirm the ownership structure of the 4 highway parcels and the ridge property. She let that sit. They'd been told those assets belonged to the Bishop family and would be, and I'm quoting the young man now, contributed to the venture by Bradley Bishop as his equity stake. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Outside the window, a truck downshifted on the hill. What did you tell them? I finally asked. I told them the truth. That those assets are held in an irrevocable trust and that any question of ownership or transfer would have to go through the trustee. She looked at me over her glasses. I did not tell them who the trustee was. That's not their business, and it's not a matter of public record. But Ray, they'll figure it out. Ashford's not a fool. The moment someone actually reads the trust documents instead of taking your son's word for it, this whole thing falls apart. And your son is standing on top of it. My son had promised another man a fortune he didn't have. He'd offered up my life's work as his own poker chip. And he'd done it to a man who builds glass towers for a living and does not lose money gently. When's the dinner? Diane asked. Tonight. 7. She took off her glasses. You could stop it right now. One phone call. I ring Ashford's counsel. I clarify the ownership. And the deal dies before the soup's served. Your son gets embarrassed in a conference room instead of at his own table. It's cleaner. She paused. It's also kinder. And I thought about that. I want you to know I really did think about it. Because Diane wasn't wrong. There was a version of that day where I picked up the phone and spared everyone the worst of it. But I'd spent 3 years being spared. I'd spent 3 years letting things go, patching the roof, telling myself it would hold one more season. And every time I stayed quiet, my son learned the same lesson a little deeper, that his father would absorb anything. That the old man was safe to step on because the old man never stepped back. Some truths have to arrive on their own 2 feet in the room where the lie was told, in front of the people the lie was told to. Not out of cruelty, out of the simple fact that a lie told in public has to die in public, or it doesn't die at all. No, I said, I'm going to be at that dinner. Diane studied me for a long time. Then she almost smiled. You built that trust to outlast people, she said. I didn't think I'd live to watch it work. Here's something you learn when you've buried the only person who ever really knew you. The house gets loud with silence. And in that silence, you notice who's still willing to sit with you in it. For me, that was June. June is my granddaughter, Bradley and Sloane's girl. She's 15, all elbows and opinions, with her grandmother's stubborn chin and a habit of turning up in my workshop when the tension in the main house gets to be too much. Her parents didn't like her spending time out there. Too much sawdust. Too much of the old life they were trying to sand off the family. But June came anyway. She'd sit on the stool by the bench and do her homework while I worked, and sometimes she'd ask me to teach her something, and I'd put a chisel in her hand and stand behind her and guide it, the way Stanislaw once stood behind me. The afternoon of the dinner, she found me in the shop cleaning up because I couldn't help myself. I was making it look nice even though I'd been told to vanish. "Grandpa," she said from the doorway. She looked worried in a way that a 15-year-old shouldn't have to. "Are you really going to the lake tonight?" "Who told you that?" "Mom. She said you'd be more comfortable there." June came in and sat on her stool. "But you don't look comfortable. You look like you did at Grandma's funeral." Children see everything. We forget that. We talk over their heads, and we think the words go past them, but they catch every one and they hold on to it longer than we do. "June," I said, "can I ask you something, and will you tell me the truth, even if it feels like being disloyal?" She nodded slowly. "What does your dad say about the house? When he talks to your granddad, Ashford? When he thinks you're not listening?" She looked down at her hands, and what she told me broke something loose in my chest that I've been holding in place for a year. "He says it's his," she said quietly. "He says when you—" She stopped, and her eyes filled. "He says when you're gone, it all comes to him anyway, so it's basically already his. He told Grandpa Gerald that, at Easter. I heard them on the porch." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, angry at the tears. "And Grandpa Gerald laughed and said something about how you can't take it with you. And Dad laughed too." I sat down on the bench next to her. I put my arm around my granddaughter, and she leaned into my shoulder the way she used to when she was small and the thunder scared her. "He's wrong, isn't he?" she said into my shirt. It wasn't really a question. She knew me better than her father did. That was the whole tragedy of it, sitting there in one sentence from a 15-year-old. My granddaughter understood who I was. My son had never once bothered to look. "He's wrong," I said. "But June, I need you to do something for me tonight. I need you to be there at dinner. I need you to sit quiet and watch, no matter what happens. Can you do that?" She pulled back and looked at me. There was something of Maggie in her face, some flint. "What's going to happen?" "The truth," I said. "It's going to walk in the front door around 7 o'clock. And I'd like you to see it, because you're the only one in that house who ever deserved to." At 6 that evening, I did not drive to the lake cabin. I went upstairs to the bedroom I'd shared with my wife for 38 years, the room they'd never quite had the nerve to move me out of, and I took my one good suit out of the closet. Charcoal gray. Maggie picked it out for our 40th anniversary. I hadn't worn it since her funeral. It hung a little looser than it used to. Grief takes weight off a man. But when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the puttering old fool my son saw. I saw Raymond Bishop, the man who'd built every wall around me. And I saw, faintly, the young carpenter who'd stood on a collapsing farmhouse roof at 26 and decided he would make something out of nothing or die trying. In the top drawer of the dresser, under Maggie's folded scarves that I've never been able to give away, there's a cigar box. Inside it, the original deed to the Ridge property from 1979, the trust documents, and one photograph. Maggie and me, standing in front of the framed-out shell of this house, covered in dust, grinning like fools. Behind us, you can just see the fireplace going up, the one with our initials in the cornerstone. I took the trust documents out. I folded them into the inside pocket of the charcoal suit, not to wave them around. I want to be clear about that. I've watched enough men mistake noise for strength. I took them because a truth ought to be able to prove itself when the moment comes, quietly, without shouting. Then I went downstairs to my son's dinner party in my own house. Sloane saw me first, and the color went out of her face. She was in the front hall in a dress that cost more than my first truck, arranging lilies in a vase. White lilies. Maggie hated lilies, said they smelled like the inside of a funeral home. Sloane wouldn't have known that. She'd never asked. "Ray," she said, I thought. Bradley said you were going to the lake. Change of plans, I said pleasantly. It's my daughter-in-law's big night. I couldn't miss it. She didn't know what to do with that. Before she could find an answer, Bradley came out of the dining room. And when he saw me in the charcoal suit, standing in the front hall like I belonged there, because I did, something crossed his face that I hadn't seen since he was a boy caught in a lie. Fear. Just a flash of it. Dad. He crossed me fast and low. That landlord's voice again, quiet enough for just the two of us. What are you doing? We talked about this. You talked, I said. I listened. There's a difference. Dad, these people are important. This is the most important night of my life. Gerald is about to make me a partner. Do you understand what that means for this family? I am asking you. His jaw was tight now. I am asking you to not embarrass me. Go upstairs. Stay in your room. Please. Please. I looked at my son, at the panic under the polish, and for one last moment I felt the old pull to make it easy for him. To go upstairs. To let it slide. One more season. Then, from the top of the staircase, I heard June's voice. Grandpa's sitting with us. She came down the stairs in a dress she clearly hated, her chin up, her grandmother's chin. Already set him a place. Bradley turned on her. June. But there was a knock at the door. The heavy brass knocker I forged in my own shop 20 years ago in the shape of an oak leaf. The Ashfords had arrived. Gerald Ashford filled a doorway the way rich men learn to. He came in with his wife on his arm and a bottle of wine that probably cost 4 figures, and he was already talking, already running the room, complimenting the house, my house, as though he were appraising it for purchase, which I would come to understand he essentially was. Bradley, my boy, he boomed, clapping my son on the shoulder. I have to tell you, every time I come up this ridge, I fall a little more in love with it. You don't find timber work like this anymore. They don't build them like. And then he saw me. I watched it happen. I watched Gerald Ashford's eyes land on my face, and I watched 11 years of memory catch up to him all at once. Because Gerald and I had met before. Long before Bradley ever knew Sloan. Gerald Ashford had come up this ridge a decade earlier with a briefcase and an offer for 4 highway lots and a handshake he was sure I'd take. And I'd poured him a cup of coffee on the porch and told him, politely, that the land wasn't for sale, and it wasn't going to be for sale, and no number he wrote down was going to change that. He'd never forgotten it. Men like, Gerald, don't forget the deals that got away. They itch. You, Gerald said. The boom had gone out of his voice. Raymond Bishop, I said and put out my hand. Good to see you again, Gerald. It's been a while. 11 years, if I'm counting. He shook my hand automatically, but he was already turning to look at Bradley, and I saw the first crack open in the evening. You two know each other? There was a silence in the front hall that you could have stood a ladder in. Bradley started. I'm his father, I said. Gerald Ashford looked at me. He looked at the house. He looked at my son. And I watched a very expensive machine begin, slowly, to calculate. Sloan recovered first because women in that family are trained to smooth cracked plaster. Let's all go through to dinner, she said brightly. Everything's getting cold. So we sat at my table in my dining room, under the beam I'd raised with a block and tackle and my own 2 shoulders. Gerald at the head, because Bradley put him there. Bradley to his right. Sloan fluttering. Gerald's wife making small talk about the drive up. June beside me, silent, watching exactly as I'd asked. And me, at the foot of my own table, in a charcoal suit, saying almost nothing. For the first course, Gerald tried to put the pieces back the way he wanted them. So, Ray, he said, cutting into his food, Bradley tells me you're retired now. Enjoying the golden years up here. A little laugh. Must be nice, having your son handle everything. Bradley handles a great deal, I agreed. He's got vision, this one. Gerald pointed his fork at my son. That's what I keep telling my board. Young men with vision and assets. That's a rare combination. Most of them have one or the other. He took a sip of wine. The venture we're discussing, Ray, I don't know if Bradley's filled you in. It's a special thing. We take his family's holdings, these highway parcels, this ridge, we roll them into an Ashford project, and we build something this whole county remembers. His equity, my expertise. He smiled at me, and there was a test buried in the smile. You must be very proud of what you're leaving him. The table waited. Bradley had gone very still, and here's where I could have detonated it. One sentence. He doesn't own any of it. I could have watched my son's face come apart in front of the man he'd sold his soul to impress. But I've buried people I loved, and I've laid enough foundations to know that the thing you build in anger cracks by the second winter. So I didn't detonate it. I set it down gently, like a level on a beam, and I let it find its own line. Gerald, I said, before Bradley and I talk about what I'm leaving him, I think I should talk about what you'd be building on. You're a careful man. You didn't get where you are by rolling your firm's name onto land without reading the deed. Something flickered in Gerald's eyes. The lawyer's phone call, 3 weeks back. The word trust. I could see it surfacing. Bradley's counsel assured us the ownership was clean, Gerald said slowly. Bradley's counsel, I said, spoke to my counsel. A woman named Diane Kessler. And what Diane told them, Gerald, is that every parcel you're talking about tonight, the 4 lots, the ridge, this house we're sitting in, is held in an irrevocable trust. I'll let it settle. The Bishop Family Trust, set up in 1994. And nothing moves in or out of that trust, not 1 square foot, without the signature of the trustee. Gerald put down his fork. And who, he said, in a voice that had gone very quiet and very cold, is the trustee? I reached into the inside pocket of the charcoal suit. I laid the folded trust documents on the table next to my plate. I didn't push them at anyone. I just set them down where the light could reach them. I said. I want to describe what my son's face did, because I'll carry it the rest of my life. It wasn't anger at first. It was the face of a man watching the floor he's standing on turn of water. Bradley looked at the documents, and he looked at me, and I watched him understand in real time that the ground he'd built his entire reinvention on had never been ground at all. It had been a story he told, and the man who owned the actual dirt had been out in the workshop the whole time, being told to pack his things. Dad, his voice cracked on the one syllable. What are you? Let me finish, son. It's important that Gerald hears all of it, so nobody leaves this table confused. I turned back to Gerald. My son believes this house is his. He believes the land is his. He's told you, I guess, that it comes to him when I die, and so it's as good as is already. I glanced at Bradley. You said as much at Easter. On the porch. You didn't know my granddaughter could hear you. June was staring at her plate. A tear dropped onto the tablecloth. But a trust isn't a will, I went on. It doesn't wait for a man to die. It's alive right now, tonight, and it does exactly what the man who wrote it tells it to do. Which means Bradley has offered you, as his equity, a fortune he does not own and cannot deliver. Not tonight. Not when I'm gone. Not ever, unless I put my name to it. I looked at my son, and I never did, because he never once asked. In 3 years under this roof, my son never asked me a single question about the deed. He was too busy planning to inherit me. The silence in that dining room was total. Somewhere in the kitchen, a caterer set down a pan, and it rang like a bell. Gerald Ashford was not looking at me anymore. He was looking at Bradley, and his face had gone through shock and out the other side into something worse for my son than any anger, contempt. The particular contempt of a con man who's discovered he's been conned by an amateur. You brought me up here, Gerald said very softly, to sign a partnership, contributing land that you don't own. Gerald, I can explain, Bradley started. You represented, in writing, through counsel, that you held title. I will hold title. It's a formality. He's an old man. He's not going to. And there it was, out in the open, in front of me, in front of his own daughter. He's an old man. He's not going to. My son couldn't even finish the sentence, but everyone at that table finished it for him. Gerald stood up. He set his napkin on his plate with the terrible calm of a man who has just decided to spend money on lawyers. Bradley, he said, on Monday morning, my firm's attorneys are going to look very carefully at every representation you've made to us over the past 4 months. If any of them constitute fraud, and offering assets you don't own tends to qualify, that will no longer be a family matter. Do you understand me? He turned to his wife. Get your coat, Carol. We're leaving. And Gerald Ashford walked out of the house he'd coveted for 11 years, having finally seen the inside of it, having finally learned that the old man on the porch who wouldn't sell him the land still, all these years later, held every card. He didn't even look at me on the way out. But at the door, he paused, and without turning around, he said, Bishop, you still build them right. And then he was gone. The dinner party was over. The Ashford's car went down the ridge with its taillights bleeding red into the dark, and the caterers packed up their untouched courses, and Sloan went upstairs without a word to anyone and shut the bedroom door hard enough that the whole house felt it. That left 3 of us in the dining room. Me, my son, and June, who hadn't moved. Bradley stood at the head of the table where Gerald had left him, and he was shaking. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were wet and furious at the same time. Do you have any idea, he said, what you just did to me? I do, I said quietly. I'll let you hear yourself out loud. You humiliated me. In my own, he caught himself. Even now, even here, the reflex. He couldn't say my own house because the deed was folded on the table between us. It was never yours, son, I said. That's the thing you can't get past. Not because I wanted to keep it from you. Because you never wanted it. Not the house, the actual house, the wood and the work. You wanted what it could buy you in a rich man's living room. You wanted to hand your mother's ridge to Gerald Ashford so he'd let you sit at his table. I stood up slowly. My knees complained the way they do. I built this place for a woman who's gone, and for a boy who used to beg me to let him drive one nail. I don't know where that boy went, but I've spent 3 years waiting for him to come back, and tonight I finally understood he isn't coming. Not while there's a shortcut he'd rather take. So this is my punishment. His voice was bitter. You wait until I'm in front of Gerald. You let me hang myself. You enjoy I enjoyed none of it. And I'm in it so completely that it stopped him. You're my son. Watching you tonight was the worst hour of my life since your mother died. There's no part of me that's glad. But I'd rather you lose a lie standing up than keep it on your knees. That's not punishment, Bradley. That's the last thing I've got left to teach you. And God help me. It's the only way you've ever been willing to learn. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He turned and went up the stairs after his wife. And I heard the bedroom door open and close, softer this time. In June, my granddaughter got up from her place, and she came around the long table, and she put her arms around me and held on the way she used to in the thunder. I'm proud of you, Grandpa, she whispered. 15 years old. And she was the only one in that house who understood that the man who'd just lost his son had also, finally, stopped losing himself. I'd like to tell you that was the end. That my son came down the stairs the next morning changed. That's how the story would go if I were writing it to make myself feel better. Real life is slower than that, and it doesn't tie off clean. The Monday after the dinner, Gerald Ashford's lawyers did exactly what he'd promised. They pulled apart every email, every text, every representation Bradley had made about the venture. And they found enough offers of assets he didn't own, a financial statement listing the Ridge property as his, that they could have pursued it as fraud. They didn't in the end. Not because Bradley deserved mercy, but because Gerald didn't want his own daughter's married name dragged through a courthouse. Instead, the partnership evaporated quietly and completely. The doors Bradley had spent 4 years prying open all swung shut at once. In that small world of northern Michigan developers, word travels, and the word was that Bradley Bishop had tried to sell land he didn't own to Gerald Ashford. In that business, that's a death sentence. Nobody would take his call. He lost the future he'd built out of my life's work. He lost it because it was never real, and things that aren't real can only hold weight for so long. Sloan took longer to leave than I expected, and she left more gently than I feared. She wasn't cruel in the end. She was raised in that world the way Bradley wanted to be, and when the world Bradley promised her turned out to be a story, she simply, sadly, stopped believing in it. She and Bradley separated that spring. She took an apartment in town. And here is the part one didn't see coming, the part that mattered most. She let June choose where to live, and June chose the ridge. Now here's what I did with the trust, because people always ask, and the answer surprised even Diane. I didn't cut my son out. I thought about it. I sat in Diane's office above the hardware store, with the ancient philodendron and the terrible coffee, and I told her I'd earned the right to leave him nothing, and she agreed that I had. And then I told her I wasn't going to, and she almost smiled because I think she'd known I wouldn't. Here's why. Disinheriting Bradley would have proven him right. It would have made the whole thing about money, about who deserved the ridge, about winning. And it was never about that. It was about a boy who was taught, somewhere along the way, that what you own matters more than what you make, and who spent his best years trying to own his way into a room instead of building his way into one. So I restructured. I set aside a trust for June, for her education, and for the days she's grown, enough to give her a start without giving her a reason to stop. I put money toward Earl Dunmore's retirement. Earl worked beside me for 30 years framing houses, and no man who ever swung a hammer for me was going to spend his old age counting change. And I created something new, a fund at the County Technical College for kids who want to learn the trades, carpentry, masonry, electrical, the work that builds the actual world. The Margaret Bishop Fund, named for the woman who believed, long before I did, that the things you make with your hands are the only monuments that ever really last. And Bradley I left a share, a real one, but not the ridge. The ridge I put in trust for June, to pass to her directly one day, with a single condition written into it in Diane's careful hand. This property may not be sold, subdivided, or developed. It is to be lived in, because I didn't build a house so that someday it could become a shopping center with Gerald Ashford's name on the sign. I built a home. And a home is the one thing my son never understood the value of, right up until he lost the deed he'd forgotten to check. It's been a little over a year now. June turned 16 last month. I taught her to hang a door properly so it swings true and latches without a shove. She's better with her hands at 16 than her father ever was at 40, and she doesn't even know yet what that's worth. She will. Bradley and I are not what we were. I won't pretend otherwise, but we're something. He came up the ridge one Sunday in the fall without calling first, and he stood in the yard for a long while before he came to the door, and when I opened it, he didn't have a speech ready. He just said, "I lost everything, Dad." And I said, "No, you lost the thing that was never yours. There's a difference, and someday it'll be the difference that saves you." He comes up now some Sundays. He sits in the workshop where he won't ruin his suit because he doesn't wear the suits anymore. He's selling insurance out of a strip mall office and living in a rented condo. And the strange thing, the thing I didn't expect, is that he seems lighter for it, as if the weight of pretending had been heavier than the thing itself. Last week he picked up a chisel off my bench, and he turned it over in his hand, and he asked me quietly if I'd show him how to sharpen it. And I stood behind my son the way Stanislaw once stood behind me, the way I once stood behind him when he was small enough to beg for one nail, I put my hands over his hands, and we worked the blade across the stone together until it caught the light like water. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. But something got put right in that hour that no deed and no trust and no dinner party could ever have fixed. Because it turns out I hadn't lost the boy after all. He'd just gotten buried under everything he thought he was supposed to want. And you can dig a thing like that back out if you're patient and if you're willing to get your hands dirty and if you never quite stop believing it's down there. People ask me sometimes if I regret it. The dinner. Letting him walk into it in front of Gerald. Not picking up the phone the way Diane offered and sparing him the fall. And my answer surprises them. No, I don't regret it. I regret that he made it necessary. I regret every year I patched the roof and told myself it would hold because all that patching taught my son was that his father would absorb anything. And a lesson like that only ends one way. With a whisper in a workshop telling the man who built the house to get out of it before the important people arrive. The accident of getting old is that everyone assumes you've already given up whatever you were holding. My son looked at me and saw a man with nothing left to take. He forgot that I'd spent my whole life making sure that the things that mattered couldn't be taken, not by weather, not by time, and not by a boy in a good suit who'd forgotten whose name was on the deed. If there's one thing my story has taught me, it's this. Don't measure a man by what he owns. Owning is easy. You can inherit it, marry it, borrow it, or lie your way onto the edge of it for an evening. Measure a man by what he's built with his own two hands and refuse to hand over cheap. Measure him by the initials carved in the cornerstone where nobody thinks to look. Those are the things that outlast the weather. Those are the things that outlast the people who try to take them. And those are the only things, in the end, that were ever really yours to give. I built this house for a woman I loved and a boy I raised. She's gone, and he got lost for a while. But the house still stands true and square, every joint holding. And my granddaughter's asleep upstairs in a room I framed before her father was born, in a home that can never be sold, on a ridge that will still be a ridge and not a parking lot long after I've laid down my tools for good. That's the deed that matters, not the paper in the cigar box, the living one, the one you build. If this story meant something to you tonight, if you've ever been underestimated by the people who should have known you best, or made to feel small in a place you built with your own hands, I hope you'll leave a comment and tell me about it. Your story matters too, and someone reading needs to hear it. And if you'd like to stay for more stories about family, dignity, and the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground without raising your voice, I'd be honored if you subscribed and came back for the next one. Because sometimes the man they told to pack his things is the only one who ever truly owned the house. They just forgot to check.